of your will.
All right, so the title of this talk tonight is Giordano Bruno, Heretic, Magician, and Gnostic Saint. So tonight I want to look at the life and works of Giordano Bruno, as well as some of his metaphysical theories and some of his ideas on magic. So Bruno has exerted a fascination on me for some time now, and every time I've sat down to try and understand what he's getting at in his works, it's been really difficult to actually work through that writing. So finally I got my butt into gear, and I decided to really try and dig into it and figure out what was going on with Giordano Bruno. And this lecture is the product of that. And I hope that if that same fascination with Bruno has tapped you as well, that this can be a little window into the life and work of Giordano Bruno. Okay, so my thesis for this lecture is that Bruno can be seen as one of those untimely figures in the history of ideas, standing on the border between two worlds, an old world and a new world. Bruno had one foot in the pagan and magical worldview that he believed to have inherited from the ancients, and one foot in the new scientific revolution taking place in Europe during his lifetime. And Bruno, in his own enigmatic way, attempted to unite these two worldviews by revitalizing the old pagan and magical values in the context of the new science. And in this way, Bruno's natural philosophy can be seen as a precursor to the philosophical system of Thelema, which itself straddles these two worlds, attempting a reconciliation of them. And I think it's up to us as modern magicians to carry out this project. And Bruno, so I contend, is a blazing star that can illuminate this path forward. All right, so if you can get anything from this lecture, I hope it's that the next time you attend a Gnostic Mass and you hear Giordano Bruno's name listed off in the collects, that name has a little bit more meaning and resonance for you than it did before. If we can accomplish that, then I think we'll have been successful. Okay, so I want to start with a brief biographical sketch of the life and works of Giordano Bruno. So Bruno was a Dominican friar, philosopher, mathematician, poet, astrologer, magician, etc., etc., etc. He was an all-around Renaissance man in the literal sense, right? So he was born in 1548 in Nola, in the Italian region of Campania. At the age of 17, he entered the Dominican order, taking the name Giordano. So he was born Filippo Bruno, and upon entering the Dominican order, took the name Giordano. He completed his novitiate for the priesthood and became an ordained priest in 1572 at the age of 24. And even at this very early age in Bruno's life, he was getting into trouble with the religious authorities, right? So he was accused of defending the Arian heresy, of recommending controversial texts to novitiates, and all sorts of things, really. And in 1576, he learned that an indictment was being prepared against him in Naples, and so he fled, spending the next 15 years wandering Europe. And there's a really interesting sense in which Bruno's exile is connected to his experimental style, intellectually, literary, his literary style, and in terms of his religious thought as well.
Would you say almost in like a hermetic sense, and like a sort of a Buddha and Muhammad, like sort of separation from the mainstream in order to sort of figure certain things out that are crucial or necessary that you need space to?
Right. I think that's pretty much what that's about. It seems that his exile at least this is my take on it, that his exile allowed him to really challenge the presuppositions of the reigning paradigm of his time. So there was this sense of being not actually belonging anywhere enabled him to really challenge a lot of the contents of the worldview that he had inherited. Yeah?
Like the Arian heresy?
The Arian heresy is basically, it's the idea that Jesus Christ is subordinate to God the Father. Okay. In a very short and small nutshell. All right, good. Okay, so Bruno remains quiet for a while, but in 1579 he publishes an attack on a distinguished professor, which he will continue to do throughout the rest of his life. He'll publish attacks on reputable academics and on religious authorities. And him and the printer who printed the attack are arrested. This isn't too bad for Bruno because he soon gets out and he heads over to France, where he gains his doctorate in theology and begins lecturing in philosophy. All right, so during this time, Bruno gains a reputation for his prodigious memory. So one of the things that you may know about Bruno is that he developed mnemonic systems, basically ways of classifying knowledge and experience in a very powerful way. So Bruno would travel around to like popes and dignitaries and show off his prodigious memory. And people were very impressed with it. So in 1582, he publishes 3 books on memory. These are his first publications, and they are The Shadow of Ideas, The Art of Memory, and Circe's Song. Okay, in 1583, Bruno arrives in England and begins lecturing at Oxford. And this, by all accounts, is the most productive era of Bruno's life, at least in terms of his literary output. It's during this time that he produces what are known as the Italian dialogues, which are a collection of texts which consists of the Ash Wednesday Supper, on cause, principle, and unity, which we'll look at a little bit more tonight, on the infinite world, the infinite universe and worlds, the expulsion of the triumphant beast, and on the heroic frenzies.
They let a Catholic priest teach at Oxford.
Oh well, he's no longer a priest at this point. Yeah, okay. He'll try to get like reinstated a couple of times, but he won't be successful.
Okay, because England hated the Catholics at that point.
Yeah, so right, so he's no longer a priest at this point. Okay, so in this body of work, in the Italian dialogues, Bruno develops a deep metaphysical system that was extremely radical for its time. We'll look at some of those ideas in just a moment, but by all accounts, I mean, the stuff that Bruno was writing was extreme in terms of the climate that he was living in. And he pissed a lot of people off. So he wasn't afraid of insulting anybody, and he often did assault any person who held some sort of position of power. And he had very controversial ideas. And this lost him the support of a lot of his friends, and he found it very difficult to find a home and to find work. Some think that he wasn't very smart in this regard because he basically alienated himself from everybody around him. So this is just a little tidbit. The Archbishop of Canterbury mocked Bruno for supporting, quote, the opinion of Copernicus that the earth did go round and the heavens did stand still. Whereas in truth, it was his own head which rather did run round and his brains did not stand still. However, I think history has proven that Bruno got the upper hand in this regard. Yeah. Okay, so between 1585 and 1592, Bruno again wanders Europe, and these are the last years of his wandering before he is imprisoned. And these last years of his life are actually really interesting because this is when Bruno produces all of his texts on magic. And there's a lot of, I wouldn't say necessarily controversy, but there's a question about how these texts are actually to be interpreted. Because Bruno spent that previous period in which the Italian dialogues were written developing a fairly radical metaphysical system, and then he starts writing on magic. And there's some question about how to interpret these texts in light of his previous work, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. Okay, in 1591, he receives an invitation to Venice. So there's this guy, he's like a patron, he's like, Bruno, why don't you come over to Venice and tutor me for a while and do some magic for me, and I'll pay for your way and all of that jazz. And Bruno had heard that at this time the Venetian Inquisition had cooled down, so things might not be bad for him if he went to Venice. It turns out he was wrong about that. So this guy who brought Bruno over actually denounces him to the Venetian Inquisition. Apparently he was unsatisfied with the tutoring that Bruno had to offer and his magic. And so he denounces Bruno to the Inquisition. And Bruno is arrested on May 22nd, 1592. Among the charges leveled against him were blasphemy and heresy, a belief in the plurality of worlds, and personal misconduct.
Just do that one.
Yeah, they just kind of do that. There's a long list, actually. Okay, so things actually weren't so bad for Bruno under the Venetian Inquisition. They seemed to be not ready to kill him. Unfortunately, the Roman Inquisition asks for his transfer to Rome, and apparently you don't want to get called to Rome to be tried, right? So he's sent there in 1593. And this leads to his final years, his trial, and his execution. So the Roman Inquisition demanded full recantation of all of his heretical ideas, which Bruno flatly refused. And on the 20th of January 1600, Pope Clement VIII declared Bruno a heretic, and the Inquisition issued a sentence of death.
Not very Clement. Not very Clement.
Ah, yeah. So Bruno, when he received this sentence, was said to have replied, "Perhaps you pronounce this sentence against me with greater fear than I receive it." So Bruno's kind of a badass. On February 17th, 1600, he was burned alive at the stake, and his ashes were thrown into the Tiber River. His statue, that iconic statue that everyone associates Bruno with, it actually now stands in front of the papal chancellery, right outside the site where he was burned at the stake. And this has actually become a site of pilgrimage for all sorts of people who hold Bruno up as an icon of freedom of thought, of religious experimentation, and of scientific inquiry. All right. The Nolan Philosophy. So, the philosophy of Bruno is called the Nolan Philosophy because Bruno was born in Nola. What I want to do now is just talk a little bit about what some of his major contributions were. And to add a little context to this, in 1543, Nicholas Copernicus publishes On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. And in this text, Copernicus sets out a mathematical proof that the Earth revolves around the Sun and not the Sun around the Earth, right? So he develops his heliocentric model of the universe. And in 1558, Galileo Galilei began teaching Copernican theory. And in 1609, using a handmade telescope, Galileo discovers the moons of Jupiter. And this gave visual proof that the theory of Copernicus was in fact correct. Right? So Bruno saw himself as a natural philosopher, but more importantly, as the authentic and genuine interpreter of Copernicus. So Copernicus was mostly just not just a mathematician, he was a mathematician, right? And he was hesitant about drawing philosophical conclusions from his discovery. And Bruno thought that it was his destiny to draw out the conclusions of the discovery of Copernicus and basically demolish the old worldview. Right? So for Bruno, Copernicus's mathematical discovery showed that the traditional heavenly spheres were an illusion. The traditional heavenly spheres were the spheres of the Ptolemaic and Aristotelian system. Showed that these were an illusion, that there was no upper limit to the universe, right? That there was no top or bottom to the universe as we knew it. That the universe was infinite, with infinite solar systems similar to our own. And he also believed that suns, earths, and planets are living and inhabited beings. So it's interesting that we now know that most likely most every star in the sky is inhabited by at least one planet. Right? We've discovered over 3,000 exoplanets outside of our own solar system. And Bruno was really on track with some of his scientific speculations. Not only was Bruno a natural philosopher in the sense of coming up with various scientific speculations, but there are also profound religious consequences to his work. So Bruno believed that divinity is present in us as well as in every other heavenly body. Bruno, in a sense, believes that God is in nature and that nature is in God, which we'll talk about more in a little bit as well. He calls into question the truth value of Christianity, denying all forms of Christology, or the divinity of Christ, and goes so far as to claim that Christ was a sorcerer who perpetrated a deceit on mankind. Yeah. Probably see why people were... Yeah, they had a problem.
I always thought it was a heresy that Paul perpetrated on everybody.
That too. All right, so here's some stuff from Bruno. There are not 7 planets or wandering stars only, but innumerable such. For every world, whether of the sun type or of the earth type, is in motion. Its motion proceeding from the spirit within it. The entire globe, this star not being subject to death, dissolution, and annihilation being impossible anywhere in nature, from time to time renews itself by changing and altering all of its parts. There is no absolute up or down, as Aristotle taught. No absolute position in space, but the position of a body is relative to that of other bodies. Everywhere, there is incessant relative change in position throughout the universe, and the observer is always at the center of things. Right? So that seems to me like a precursor to the theory of relativity. And that's pretty significant. Bruno is writing here sometime in the mid-16th century. Okay, so what I want to do now is dig a little bit deeper into Bruno's ideas and see why Bruno actually believes the things that he does. All right. So, the great chain of being. The worldview that Bruno inhabits is conceived as a great chain or ladder of being, what is sometimes referred to as the scala natura, or ladder of life. And this is a divine hierarchy, with God, the most perfect and permanent being, at the top of the chain, and the most impermanent and imperfect beings being at the bottom. And this system is a perfectly ordered, this universe is a perfectly ordered and finite system, which means that if anything moves from its particular place in the chain of being, it will result in a corresponding disruption in the order of the universe. So, for example, if you were a peasant, you would remain a peasant your whole entire life. If you were a king or a noble, your job was to rule over your subjects. And any attempt to alter the order of things would result in a corresponding disorder in the universe itself. Right? And so this obviously had political ramifications. Civil disobedience and revolution were seen as not only unlawful in the juridical sense, but also as being a direct sin against God. So right here we see the chain of being with God, or Deus, at the top, and some kind of inert matter down here at the bottom. We have like fauna and trees, animals, human beings, up to the choirs of angels and archangels, and then like the heavenly city up there. Okay, so this is the worldview. This is basically a quick sketch of the worldview that the Renaissance magicians and philosophers inherited. It even is given expression in the works of Shakespeare. So, for example, the storm the night before Julius Caesar's execution is representative of the chaos and disorder which will eventually lead to his usurpation. And in Macbeth, before Duncan is murdered, there are frightful omens and portents occurring, and it's not until Malcolm, the rightful king, is restored to the throne that harmony again reigns in the kingdom. So this idea is really present during this era. Not only that, but it's basically a dualistic conception of the universe, which sees God as separate from the material world which he has created. And it also represents a progressive degradation of reality. The top of the chain is the most perfect and permanent being, whereas you go down lower and lower and lower, things become more corrupt. And basically the material world is seen as a bastardization or an imperfect copy of the divine world. And this introduces a separation into nature. There are two separate and distinct ontological realms conceived on this model. One is the intelligible or heavenly realm, and one is the sensible or material realm. And the two are separate from each other. Within this model is also the Ptolemaic and Aristotelian system of the heavenly spheres. So we see the notion of the Earth existing in the sublunary sphere, that is below the sphere of the moon. And this sphere was the sphere which was subject to corruption and decay, whereas the spheres above the Earth, the moon, and then the planets and the fixed stars were more permanent and perfect than the material world existing in the sublunary sphere. This is also a geocentric cosmos, right, with the Earth at the center. But it introduces a gulf between all sorts of things, a separation or a division between heaven and earth, between God and man, between angels and demons, between necessity and contingency, and between permanence and impermanence. And Bruno's primary task is going to be to close this gap. And in order to do this, he has to demolish this old metaphysical system which he had inherited. Yeah.
So if the sun is perfect, and that would mean there was no concept of like a supernova back then, right?
I don't believe there was a concept of a supernova. I'm not entirely positive about that.
Was this after the period where the stars were still thought to be like holes poked in the fabric of the Earth or whatever?
I'm sure that was one theory. I'm familiar with that theory from the pre-Socratics. So that is definitely way before this, but people might have thought that.
there were supernovas on record at the time.
Excellent.
Nobody thought that was a star. But it was a star first.
Yeah.
And then more like it. Some cultures do it.
Nice. Yeah.
So when you're talking about the ordered and finite system part, would you call that a closed system?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What is the meaning of necessity and contingency?
Okay. Right. Good. So necessity is basically something that has to be the case. One way of thinking about this, if you say like 1 + 1 = 2, like that's something, according to mathematical axioms, which is necessarily the case. It can't be different than how it is. And so God is conceived of as a necessary being, right? Can't be other than it is, and is absolutely perfect and unchanging. Whereas contingency is basically a way of saying that something is impermanent, that it is subject to looser laws. So when we think about material objects as being contingent, they don't follow, they're not sort of bound in the way that other divine objects are bound. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It's different, like, it's a difference between, we have a new concept now of, the necessity of, like, cause and effect in our scientific working.
Right.
And that's separate from a contingent understanding of the material world.
Right.
Maybe.
I think you're right. So one way of looking at this is necessity is something which has to be the case, and things which are contingent could be other than what they are.
I see.
Right? They could be different. Okay, so man is microcosm in the world's soul. On this model, the human being is conceived as a microcosm. Right? So although there is this gulf between the divine sphere and the corporeal sphere, man is considered as containing within himself both a divine element and a natural element. So the human being straddles both the spiritual and the material worlds. The lowest and the highest are contained within the human being themselves. In essence, the human being contains a kind of a miniature universe, is itself a miniature universe, which reflects the larger macrocosm of the universe itself. And in particular, the human being is equipped with particular faculties. So they have an intellect, so they can grasp ideal and logical objects. They have an imagination, which means that they can form images which communicate with the soul. And they're also capable of love and a recognition of divine beauty. And so it's these faculties on this model which enables the human being to have access to both a material and spiritual level of reality. And this also gives rise to a theory of correspondence, which probably most of us are familiar with to one degree or another. And the theory of correspondence attempts to organize experience according to a perceived similarity between an apparent unrelated plurality of phenomena. Right? So, for example, if you were a medieval or Renaissance magician, you might have certain stones, incense, or herbs which correlate to particular planetary influences, or certain spirits or demons might be correlated to particular hours of the day or particular days of the week. And this was thought to be possible due to the fact that everything in the universe was in one sense or another related to everything else. And human beings were capable of making use of the correspondences which existed in nature. All right. And just as the human being possessed a soul, which enabled them to straddle both the spiritual and the material world, so too does the world have a soul. the world soul, or the animus mundi, linking up the sensible and the intelligible realms. And this is going to become important for Bruno later on, but the basic idea is that man is a microcosm. If man has a soul and is capable of achieving some sort of mediation between these two levels of reality, that same type of mediation is capable in the wider universe, and the way to account for that on this model is through this idea of a world soul. We'll talk about this a little bit more. Okay, the ontological constitution of man and pneumatic rays. All right, so just as human beings have within themselves two different levels of reality, a spiritual level and a material level, so too do they have two different types of bodies. On the one hand, they have a carnal body composed of the four elements, and the carnal body enables the human being to traffic with material objects. So they go out into the world and bump up against things and receive data through the senses, and this corporeal body allows them to have trafficking with the world. On the other hand, the human being also has a spiritual body, or what is referred to as a heavenly body. This kind of links up to our contemporary conception of an astral body, which is actually a really apt term because this heavenly body was historically what was used to travel through the Empyrean, to travel through the sphere of the planets and the fixed stars. So it was like, in a sense, literally astral. All right, so whenever you posit a duality between an immaterial thing and a material thing and say that they work together, human beings usually try to give an account of how that works. How does the mind, for example, interact with the body? How does the spiritual body interact with the carnal body? And the pneuma, or spirit, was introduced as a mediating element between the soul and the body, reconciling the contradictions that existed between the two. So the substantiality of the spiritual body allowed for it to interact with the immaterial soul, to basically traffic in supra-sensory realms. And yet, man also had a physical body, and it was the pneuma which enabled the senses to communicate to the soul what was happening to the physical body as it was incarnated on earth. So in short, the spirit, the pneuma, opens up to the soul a window to the world through the five senses. And through this mediation of the spirit, the soul receives impressions from the sensory world. So how does that work? So there's a theory of perception which sees some of its first formulations in Plato, gets further developed in Aristotle, and then receives sort of a full-blown account in the Stoic philosophers. But the idea was that the eyes contain the pneuma, or an inner fire, which would be projected from the retina. This ray would be projected from the retina, which would go out and meet the rays extending from objects in the external world. Right? So the eyes would literally emit a pneumatic ray. That pneumatic ray would go out and meet rays emanating from material bodies, bring that back to the retina, and there it would translate what it had received into images and symbols, or what we might call phantasms, through the faculty of the imagination. So it was through the imaginative faculty, the capacity to make images, that the senses were able to receive input from the material world and then translate that into a type of image that was comprehensible to the soul. So Aristotle actually believed that when women were menstruating, when they looked in the mirror, drops of blood would appear in the mirror itself. It's like, dude, can't you just like go out and look and see that that's wrong? But of course, he also believed that women had less teeth than men, so he was wrong on a number of different accounts.
With teeth?
Less teeth, yeah. Some weird stuff in there is included. But this theory actually continues in various forms, even up into Descartes and Kant. And I think this image here is, it's one which we will attribute it to Descartes, but I don't think that's actually correct. But the theory really gained traction, and it was an idea that Bruno was working with. Okay. Now, this leads to a theory of erotic love. Yeah.
So I've kind of heard some stuff about that. Like our eyes, how they communicate.
Mm-hmm.
Have we developed any science on that up until right now?
Yeah, there's a lot of science on perception and theories of perception. I don't have the resources to go into them right now.
Okay.
But yeah, there's a lot of work which has been done in perception. All right, so this theory of perception, which was prominent in the ancient world, leads to a theory of erotic love. And so the idea is that when someone is in love, the pneumatic ray, which is emitted by the eye, goes out and penetrates the pupil of the other and brings back to the subject, to the soul of the subject, an image of what it has seen. Okay? So the idea is that when someone is under the influence of erotic desire or erotic love, the image which comes back to the soul is in a sense supercharged, right? It's like lit up, and it takes possession of the soul of the one who is in love. So the lover basically carves into his or her soul the image of the beloved. Right? And it's the influence of erotic desire which allows for this image to actually gain traction in the soul of the subject themselves. So what happens is that the subject is dispossessed of their own subjectivity. Right? They lose their sense of identity, being wholly occupied by the phantasmatic image of the beloved. And this can actually go terribly wrong. So for example, if the love is not requited, then the image that is brought back to the soul basically obsesses it. And a whole literature on the pathologies of erotic love are developed around this idea. However, when things go right, when the love is requited, an interesting transfer occurs. So the subject has received the image of the beloved, and that image has taken up residence in their own soul. When that love is requited, the subject then grafts an image of their own soul into the soul of the beloved, and there's a reciprocal exchange of identity. In a sense, there's an expansion and development of the identity of the lover and the beloved. And the subject is considered as having transformed itself into the object of its love. And this gives rise to what we may call a dialectic of love, where A becomes B and B becomes A. Right, so the lover becomes the beloved, and the beloved becomes the lover. Okay, so our dialectic of mystical love. Erotic desire can be directed to two different sources. So just as we saw before, there are two different levels of reality, the spiritual and the material, so too can erotic love be directed to two different sources. On the one hand, it can be directed towards natural objects and receive its satisfaction and consummation in sexuality. And this is referred to as a type of carnal love. And on the other hand, erotic desire can be directed toward God, a type of mystic love. And the consummation of that love is in union with the divine. Now, generally, carnal love is frowned upon, whereas mystic love is praised. And one of the reasons why this is the case is because carnal love is considered as a purely passive one is considered as being taken over by the erotic desire without directing that desire themselves. Whereas in mystic love, basically the subject has to transform themselves into a vehicle that can be filled with the love of God. So it's seen as a more active process as opposed to passive possession in the case of carnal love. Yeah?
Are we still talking about pneumatic rays when we're talking about this?
Yeah, well, we are. So the image which resides in the soul is basically a pneumatic image. It's a spiritual image which takes up residence in the soul, right? And so we are still in that territory.
Is it like Qigong? Like the idea of looking at a subject or an object with your chi and getting kind of feedback from that?
Couldn't say. Couldn't say. All right. So, with the distinction between carnal love and mystic love, there comes to be a type of literature which involves an idealization and a hypostatization of the feminine. Basically what this means is that natural love or carnal love was seen as being symbolic of the type of love which occurs when one directs their desire or eros towards the divine. It's just that carnal love is sort of a degraded copy of this. And so it was cool if you, for example, in your mystic poetry, idealized or hypostatized, made the female into a concrete object, a supersensory object. It was cool if you did that as long as you weren't saying that you were actually like desiring a woman. And this is like totally misogynistic, but it's definitely what's going on during the time. The female turns into a type of suprasensory entity, right? Is seen as being kind of a gateway to the suprasensory realm. And even in some cases, representing the intelligible realm itself. And this sort of mythic trope occurs throughout a number of different literary and religious traditions. So it occurs in Platonism and in Neoplatonism, in the Gnostics, in the Cathars, in Sufism, in the troubadours, and the tradition of courtly love, and is codified within various myths, right? And so if you think about this, the soul essentially communicates in the language of symbol. And so it seems that what people were doing were codifying spiritual or divine truths in the form of myths. And there was a very potent erotic element to the type of mystical theology which was being propagated at the time. So I'm just going to give a couple of examples of various myths and how that worked. So in the myth of Tiresias, Tiresias is a blind prophet who appears in a variety of different Greek myths. One of these myths is that he's walking along as a young boy one day and views Athena bathing naked in a stream and is struck blind thereby. Athena begins to feel sorry for Tiresias, and so she gives him the gift of prophecy and the capacity to speak the language of birds. Another one of these myths is that Tiresias was walking along a path one day and he came across two snakes mating. One of the snakes was female and one of the snakes was male. He killed the female snake and became a female for 7 years. So 7 years later, Tiresias is walking along a path and again sees two snakes mating. One male and one female. This time he kills the male snake and becomes a male for 7 years. So one day, Zeus and Hera are having an argument. And the subject of their dispute is which of the sexes enjoys love more. And they say, oh, I know what we can do. We can go ask Tiresias, because he's been both a man and a woman, so he should probably know. And Tiresias' response when he's asked this question is that man gives more pleasure than he receives. And Hera is pissed, and she strikes him blind. Zeus feels really bad for getting Tiresias into this mess, and so he gives Tiresias the gift of prophecy. Right. Tiresias also shows up as a spirit who can prophesy in the underworld. So in the Odyssey, Odysseus travels to the underworld and gets advice from Tiresias. In Oedipus, Tiresias tells Oedipus that he has married his mother and murdered his father. Anyways, what we see here are a couple of constant elements. One is an encounter with a goddess. Two is some sort of catastrophic or cataclysmic event. For example, being struck blind. Sometimes it's also dismemberment, being torn apart, or something unpleasant happens.
Mildly unpleasant.
Mildly unpleasant. And it results in some sort of capacity for prophecy or the ability to traffic in the supernal realm, right? The suprasensory realm. So the feminine, through all of this, begins to be viewed as a gateway to the intelligential or suprasensory realm itself. And this is an idea that will be taken up directly by Bruno. Okay. Bruno is heavily engaged with the myth of Actaeon. So in the myth of Actaeon, a young hunter, is out hunting with his dogs when he surprises the goddess Diana bathing naked in a stream. Oops. Diana transforms Actaeon into a stag, and he is subsequently mauled and devoured by his own dogs. Right?
Yay.
So what we see is the encounter with the goddess, the cataclysmic event, and then presumably there will be some type of transformation which occurs from this. And the myth itself is going to be an imaginal prop for Bruno to develop his own philosophy. So here is Bruno on the myth of Actaeon. Young Actaeon, when destiny directs his hesitant and rash deeds, sets free his mastiffs and his greyhounds in the woods on the scent of game. He sees in water the most beautiful bust and face it has ever been granted a mortal or even a god to see, made of purple and alabaster and fine gold, and thus the great hunter in turn becomes the game. The large and numerous dogs quickly devoured the stag who used to go with long, light leaps to inaccessible places. Just so am I, who in my thoughts take aim at prey up high, but they turn against me, killing me with their cruel and greedy bites. All right. So as we all know, esoteric symbolism can have a number of different interpretations. But here's kind of how Bruno breaks this down. Diana, with only her bust emerging from the water, indicates that one part of her is visible and the other part of her is invisible. That she has one foot in the intelligible realm and one foot in the sensory realm. The water represents the sensory world itself, which reflects the image of the intelligential, or the macrocosm reflected in the microcosm. The alabaster is representative of her divine beauty, while the purple is representative of her active power, and her gold hair, her divine wisdom. The dogs, the mastiffs and the greyhounds, represent the subject's will and the subject's discursive intellect, the philosopher's intellect. And the game pursued by the hunter and dogs is the suprasensory realm itself, right? The divine. So Bruno sees here in the myth of Actaeon a representation of the process of seeking and coming to know divine truths. And so what we see in Bruno is that the subject who approaches this path eventually encounters the goddess, is devoured in some sense, but thereby gains access to the intelligible realm, to the divine. So Actaeon is turned into the stag, right? And the stag is the object of the hunt. That's what Actaeon and his dogs went out to capture. But by actively pursuing the object of desire, Actaeon is transformed into that object itself. He's turned into the object which he is actively seeking. And this recapitulates the dialectic of mystic love that we looked at earlier. A has become B, and B has become A in a seemingly successful transfer. Actaeon's contemplation of the new goddess results in his death. But this might be considered the death of the material ego, which then opens up Actaeon, or the subject here, to an experience of divine truth. Actaeon has become the object of his own quest. He is transformed into that which he is seeking. Okay, and so like I said a moment ago, the myth of Actaeon becomes a phantasmatic prop that Bruno uses to articulate his own philosophy, which he's going to develop further here. So Bruno writes, Diana, the goddess that Actaeon viewed, is one, the entity itself, the entity that is truth itself. Truth, which is intelligential nature, in which the sun and splendor of higher nature shine, according to the distinction of unity between the generated and the generator, or the produced and the producer. We're going to break that down a bit. For Bruno, Diana is nature, the universe, the world. Okay, Diana and Bruno's naturalistic pantheism. So Diana represents the unity between the generated and the generator, or the produced and the producer. And since Diana is also nature, the universe, the world, she is in a sense symbolic of the unity which exists between the creator and the created, or God and nature. Now, Bruno's project is essentially a naturalistic one. He rejects the distinction between two ontologically separate realms of the spiritual and the material, and attempts to locate the divine in the natural and the natural in the divine. Basically, what Bruno is trying to do is revitalize the values of a pagan worldview which saw the universe as alive and animate within the context of a new science and philosophy. Here's a very long quote, but this is Crowley in his Confessions talking about Liber 15, the Gnostic Mass. Yeah?
Were the emerald tablets in the room before or after this?
Before. Yeah, I believe Emerald Tablet is 2nd, 3rd century AD.
We don't know if he was aware of them.
There is Bruno was aware of Hermetic texts. I don't know if he was aware of the Emerald Tablet in particular, but those were being translated while Bruno was alive, and that is those translations were largely responsible for the resurgence of Hermetic philosophy in the Renaissance. Okay, so this is Aleister Crowley on Liber 15, the Gnostic Mass, from his Confessions. Human nature demands, in the case of most people, the satisfaction of the religious instinct. And to very many, this may best be done by ceremonial means. I wish therefore to construct a ritual through which people might enter into ecstasy as they have always done, under the influence of appropriate ritual. In recent years, there has been an increasing failure to attain this object, because the established cults shock their intellectual convictions and outrage their common sense. Thus their minds criticize their enthusiasm. They are unable to consummate the union of their individual souls with the universal soul, as a bridegroom would be to consummate his marriage if his love were constantly reminded that its assumptions were intellectually absurd. I resolved that my ritual should celebrate the sublimity of the operation of universal forces without introducing disputable metaphysical theories. I would neither make nor imply any statement about nature which would not be endorsed by the most materialistic man of science. On the surface, this may sound difficult, but in practice I found it perfectly simple to combine the most rigidly rational conceptions of phenomena with the most exalted and enthusiastic celebration of their sublimity. And I think that what we see Crowley saying here is that essentially what he's trying to do is revitalize a certain type of religious ecstasy which was once capable through a proper employment of ritual means. But he's setting this up within the context of contemporary scientific worldview, right? And I think we see Bruno doing engaging in a very similar project as he attempts to revitalize the pagan values, but doing this within the context of the new science of his time. Okay, so again, Diana and Bruno's naturalistic pantheism. In order to flesh this out a bit further, we need to go back to the conception of the hierarchy of being, this time under a bit more of philosophical guise. So we saw that God was at the top of the hierarchy, right? And God is conceived here as pure actuality, as being that which is most real and most permanent, most capable of creation as well. And nature is conceived as pure potentiality, that which is fundamentally capable of being created, but only capable of being created through the influence of God. And these exist at the top level and the bottom level of the hierarchy of being. Now, each intermediary level on the hierarchy constitutes a different relationship between God and man. And in the more philosophical conception of the hierarchy, pure actuality descends downwards, eventually reaching the rational soul, while pure potentiality ascends upwards through a series of more complex forms of corporeal organization. And they meet in a coincidence of opposites in the figure of the human being, who contains both the rational soul and a heavenly body. So the point of coincidence between God and nature is man, allowing man to straddle both the intelligential and the sensible worlds, and to grasp the archetypal forms which descend from God and are responsible for creating material existence. So the idea here is that the more pure actuality turned itself into pure potentiality, the more the opposite process would take place, with pure potentiality turning itself into pure actuality. What Bruno saw here was what Nicholas of Cusa, a German theologian, called coincidentia oppositorum, or a coincidence of opposites, where two opposite spheres, the intelligential and the sensible, gradually lose their essential characteristics by transforming themselves into each other. So as we saw earlier, on the individual or microcosmic level, the human soul and the pneumatic body mediates between the intelligential and the sensible worlds. And likewise, the world soul on this model mediates between those levels on the macrocosmic scale. And Bruno is going to retain some of these traditional concepts, but he's going to attempt to rework them within the new science, and he's going to use Nicholas of Cusa's Coincidentia Oppositorum as his guide for doing this. Okay, so if the Earth revolves around the Sun, then the Earth does not reside in the position of a sublunary sphere. In fact, this overturns the conception of the Ptolemaic and Aristotelian heavenly spheres altogether, showing that they're merely illusions. And furthermore, if the universe itself is infinite, as Bruno thought it was, then the point of coincidence between pure actuality and pure potentiality, between God and nature, occurs at every single point in the universe. Right? If there's no limit to the being, then this coincidence of opposites is taking place every when and everywhere. And Bruno adopts the formulation of Nicholas of Cusa to think about this. Everything is the center, and the circumference is nowhere found. Everything is this coincidence of both God and nature. And this should be reminiscent of chapter 2, verse 3 of the Book of the Law. In the sphere I am everywhere the center, as she, the circumference, is nowhere found. So here's Bruno again. Here is one who has flown through the air, discovered the sky, found himself among the stars, passed beyond the margins of the world, banished to oblivion fantasies such as the walls built of the 1st, 9th, 10th, and all other possible spheres imagined by vain mathematicians or blind and banal philosophers. In Diana and Bruno's Naturalistic Pantheism. So Bruno states in some of these dialogues in which he's working out this idea that he's not going to make recourse to suprasensible entities or to realms outside of the natural universe itself. He's basically just going to appeal to his natural reason to figure out what's going on. And so what Bruno has done is he's basically knocked off the upper limit of the chain of being, stating that the universe is infinite. And this, in effect, denies that nature is answerable or receptive to any principle other than itself. Right? So Bruno retains the conception of the world soul here. Nature is not answerable to a divine principle, to divinity, but nature is itself intelligent. Nature, in a sense, has an intellect and a soul itself. And the world soul is capable of shaping matter from the inside, animating an infinite universe with an art that is intrinsic to itself. So the idea here is that the processes of creation are intrinsic to the world itself, and one does not need to appeal to a divine creator in order to understand the world. So the world soul creates and generates material forms, material reality, and at the same time the creation of material forms generates and creates the world soul. If that sounds somewhat paradoxical, it is. because it's an instance of the coincidentia oppositorum. Nature creates and is itself created in the act of creating. So again, Diana, nature, the universe, the world is one. The entity itself. The entity that is truth itself. Truth, which is intelligential nature, in which the sun and splendor of higher nature shine, according to the distinction of unity between the generated and the generator, or the produced and the producer. So Diana, nature, the universe, is both the generator and the generated, the produced and the producer. And Actaeon, in his transformation, becomes identified with the universe itself. Right? So man's search for the divine, for Bruno, is really a pursuit after nature itself. Okay, so this is all well and good, but Bruno still believes in God. So even though he has said that he will only appeal to his natural reason, near the end of this dialogue in which this is all occurring, he transgresses the self-imposed limit. Bruno applies the formulation that we were just looking at of the coincidence of opposites to the relationship between God and nature. Right? So no longer is this relationship taking place in nature with nature itself, but it's taking place in terms of God and the natural world. And the same dialectic of the coincidence of opposites, which drove Bruno's understanding of nature, now will drive his understanding of God. So God contains within himself all material forms, is the creator of the world and of the world's soul, that then gives rise to matter. But the world, soul, and nature also produce and create God. So God creates the world, and the world creates God. Or God creates nature, and nature, in turn, creates God. And the two sides of the dialectic are inseparable for Bruno. They coincide in a fundamental unity of being and becoming, meaning that God is present in all of nature, and nature is present in all of God. And what we see here is a development of a necessary and reciprocal relationship between God and nature. All right. Now, Bruno will go on to state things like this. If an infinite God continually expresses himself in an infinite world of infinite things, then divinity should be searched for in excrement and ashes.
Well, that would cost.
And here's a quote from Liber V. Vel Reguli. The magician should devise for himself a definite technique for destroying evil. The essence of such a practice will consist in training the mind and the body to confront things which cause fear, pain, disgust, shame, and the like. He must learn to endure them, then to become indifferent to them, then to analyze them until they give pleasure and instruction, and finally to appreciate them for their own sake as aspects of truth. And here we have Bruno again. Sorry, it's a little harder to read. So those wise men, that is the ancient Egyptians, with magic and divine rites, ascended the same ladder of nature toward the height of the divinity, as the divinity itself descends in order to communicate with the vilest things of nature. So again, Bruno sees divinity in nature and nature in divinity. In a sense, everything is alive with the divine for Bruno. And he thinks that he has abolished the separation between these two distinct ontological realms of God and the natural. And for Bruno, the problem of understanding God has now become the problem of understanding nature itself, and in particular, the laws of nature. Okay? So for Bruno, not only will this require the use of the intellect, the scientist, the philosopher, the artist, anybody who takes on an investigation of nature, but importantly, a heroic employment of mystical love.
Are there any examples that you know specifically of things that probably Overkeen has discussed of? Like, I know with the Gnostic Mass, that was part of it that he intentionally used the things that have negative connotations with religious imagery and words and all that kind of stuff. But
If you haven't checked it out yet, I would recommend the poem Leia Sublime. I think that will give you a good sense of the type of thing Bruno's getting at here. Okay, so for Bruno, the problem of understanding God is the problem of understanding nature itself, the laws of nature. And this requires the use of the intellect, but not only the use of the intellect, also what he calls a heroic employment of mystical love. So as we saw back in our Dialectic of mystical love, which we're getting to again, the lover is possessed by the pneumatic image of the beloved. And when this love is requited, the subject is transformed into the object of that love. So for Bruno, coming to understand God is essentially coming to understand nature. But one has to form an adequate image of what nature is in order for that love of the divine to then be reflected back to oneself, in order to consummate that transformation. So Actaeon, devoured by his own dogs, having undergone this transformation, is then able to contemplate Diana, nature, the universe, or the world. And the more the laws of the universe are assimilated by the investigator of nature, the more an identification with nature and the divine occurs. So everything which exists for Bruno is assimilated into the being of what he calls the heroic enthusiast. Okay, so Bruno here is making a call for a healing of the division between nature and the divine decreed by Christianity. He's attempting to close that gap between nature and the divine. And he abolishes the distinction between two separate ontological levels of reality, and thereby abolishes the need for a being to come and redeem us from this state, in particular in the form of a mediator, in particular Christ. And this being unnecessary for Bruno, Bruno denounces all forms of Christology. Yeah.
Did he choose the word Christ because that was the time that he was living in? I mean, because everyone in that time was using the word Christ.
Well, I mean, it's definitely a part of the theology which Bruno is fighting against. Right? The word Christ is not being deployed loosely here. Right? It represents obviously an aspect of a very distinct theological tradition. Yep. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. It's fine.
Okay. Good. Oh, I can go back one. So, oops, too far. So through intellectual, imaginative, and even erotic effort, man is able to transcend his purely animal state through science, art, and magic, in fact. And speaking of magic, So what I want to do now is look at one of Bruno's texts on magic, which is called A General Account of Bonding. This is the translation of the work. All right, so for Bruno, the universe is infinite, consisting of a fundamental unity and coincidence of opposites between the natural and the divine. Yet human beings are still, on the whole, finite creatures, and in particular, we know and understand according to a finite reason. And it's this gap between our finite capacities and an infinite universe, which for Bruno opens up a space for magic.
Can you repeat that again?
Yeah, so for Bruno, human beings are finite creatures, yet we exist in a finite world, right? And so there's naturally a limit which is set to what we can know, right? Because we are, in a sense, finite. And it's this gap between the finite capacities of human beings and an infinite universe, which for Bruno opens up a space for the practice and theory of magic. Does that make sense? Yeah. Cool. So as I said earlier, there's some controversy over how Bruno's texts on magic should be interpreted. And Bruno appears to adopt some of the old metaphysical theories that he had spent so much time rejecting in his texts on magic. But we also see throughout the text various developments of his own metaphysical theories. And so the sense that I get from it is what Bruno is trying to do is redefine magic, redefine a theory of magic in light of the theories that he has inherited. So he's attempting to give new meaning to the terms that have been handed down to him. So he'll say things like demons, spirits, and divinities impress their forms on us by entering through that imaginative and pneumatic faculty which we were talking about earlier. And they engender mental states of either attraction or repulsion, joy or fear, hate or love. And for Bruno, there's two types of people in the world. There are those who direct and monitor the influences impressed through the imaginative and pneumatic faculty, who are able to control those images impressed upon them, and those who are ruled by the influences of this imaginative and pneumatic faculty. So for Bruno, everyone is basically somebody who acts or somebody who is acted upon. And the former, those who direct and monitor the influences impressed upon them, can only be accomplished by one who is constrained, for Bruno, by the bond of love. And we'll see how that works in just a moment. So here is Bruno again. All affections and bonds of the will are reduced to two, namely aversion and desire, hatred and love. Yet hatred itself is reduced to love, whence it follows that the will's only bond is eros. It has been proved that all other mental states are absolutely, fundamentally, and originally nothing other than love itself. As regards all those who are dedicated to philosophy or magic, it is fully apparent that the highest bond, the most important, and the most general belong to eros. And that is why the Platonists called love the great demon, or the daemon magnus. Okay, so the job of the magician is to basically establish links or bonds to bind other people and objects to him or herself. And the fundamental bond that the magician utilizes is eros. So we can think about this So if you do like a love spell, for example, right? Basically what you are doing is you are creating a bond which will bring the person whom you are attracted to you. And you have to have knowledge of how that individual is constituted, their particular dispositions. But in order to bring them to you, some type of bond has to be created between you and the other person to bring that desired object to yourself. And by creating these bonds, the magician is permitted to act upon agents in occult and imperceptible ways. Okay? So here's just a very sort of quick formulation of this. So we need an operator, what Bruno calls the Vinciens, a bond itself, which Bruno calls the vinculum, and a subject who is to be bound, the Vinciendo. Right? And so the magician employs a bond that will bring the subject to him or her, or make the subject do what he or she desires. And everyone for Bruno is either somebody who manipulates others through the use of bonds, or is themselves manipulated, the binder or the one bound. So for Bruno, this is sort of an unavoidable reality of the world. When Bruno collapsed the distinction between the sensible and the intelligible realm, he also believed himself to have destroyed the theory of correspondence between those two realms as well. And so he basically sees the universe as consisting in a series of bonds which link individuals and subjects and objects together. And the magician, by employing the bond of love, is in a sense capable of bringing the subject or object of his desire to him or herself and reducing the apparent multiplicity of the world down into an underlying unity. Right? So one way of thinking about this is that if you do success magic and you try and bring money to you, basically what you are doing is you are going after some object which is perceived to be separate from yourself. Through the bond you apply to it, you bring that object to you and dissolve the apparent separation between you and it. Of course, this is somewhat of a reciprocal relationship. So the magician trains themselves to utilize these bonds to effect a transformation in the subject. And the catch is that the magician can only do this by modeling their activity upon the processes that are at play within the universe itself. So the magician has to, in effect, have knowledge of the laws of nature in order to apply these bonds correctly. Yeah.
So what you're really saying is that magicians really can't are more than like a mathematicians, but mathematicians are never.
No, I don't think that's exactly what I'm saying. And so first of all, this is what Bruno's saying. So the magician is somebody who, in essence, is capable of directing the influences which are impressed upon them through various occult qualities in the universe, right? Mm-hmm. And they're capable of doing this through the application of particular, what Bruno calls bonds. You could think of them as conjurations or as of rites. But I don't think that, this is necessarily something that, for example, a mathematician or an artist or a natural philosopher could not, in theory, do, right? The magician knows how to control these faculties, this process, but I don't think it's necessarily something which other types of activities exclude.
Yeah, that's what I was saying, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah. Mathematicians have a hard time playing with
Oh, all of them?
Well, ones I met.
Okay. Right, so well, in order to be able to utilize magic, the magician, according to Bruno, needs to have a knowledge of how the laws of the universe work. And so as we have seen, divinity, for Bruno, by creating, is itself creating. God becomes nature, and nature becomes God in a coincidence of opposites. And they come together in an underlying and fundamental unity. And through the employment of the occult bond, the magician must him or herself become the object that is bound. The manipulator must become the manipulated in a reciprocal process and exchange, like we saw in the Dialectic of Mystical Love. So again, if we go back to, for example, success magic, or let's go back to the love spell. In the love spell, the operator brings the subject to them, right? And that subject then acts upon the object who is upon the person who has brought them to them, right? So although the manipulator at first manipulates some aspect of the universe to come to itself, once that object is achieved, that then acts upon the person who brought it to them. And what for Bruno appears to occur here is that this apparent multiplicity of the world, which we generally encounter, is reduced down to a fundamental unity by employing magic. The sense of distinction or separateness between the subject and the object is dissolved through the practice of magic.
So, excuse me.
Yeah.
So is this actually the law that the magician needs to abide by to become manipulated, actually? I mean, maybe I'm not saying that. Is that part of the law?
Yeah, I think that's part of the law for the magician on Bruno's work. They have to fundamentally identify themselves with this dialectic of mystical love. Yeah, I mean, at this point, it's not occurring at the level of God and nature, but it's occurring between the magician and the object of his or her desire. But essentially, for Bruno, what's happening when we do magic is we're reducing some multiplicity in the universe into a fundamental unity, right, in our experience, and thereby actually tapping in to a process which is at play in nature itself. All right, so magic then becomes a means for assimilating the whole of the universe into oneself. Like science and like art, magic can lead to an apotheosis of the human agent through a complete identification with nature and God.
Apotheosis means like disintegration.
Apotheosis means identification with divinity, becoming the human agent becoming divine themselves. Yeah. Spiritual enlightenment is another way of putting it. Yeah.
And how far did he develop these ideas? Like, did he write books or?
Yeah. He did write some dialogues. There are a section of Bruno's writings which are purely dedicated to magical theory and the practice of magic.
So he wrote prolifically on them?
Yeah, it was kind of in the last years of his life. So they were the last dialogues he was writing. But there's definitely some stuff there to take a look at if you're interested. Okay. So, conclusion. Bruno can be seen as one of those unlikely figures in the history of ideas standing on the border between two worlds, an old world and a new. Bruno had one foot in the pagan and magical world that he believed to have inherited from the ancients, and 1 foot in the new scientific revolution taking place in Europe during his lifetime. And Bruno, in his own enigmatic way, attempted to unite these two worldviews by revitalizing the old pagan and magical values in the context of the new science. And in this way, Bruno's natural philosophy can be seen as a precursor to the philosophical system of Thelema, which itself straddles these two worlds, attempting a reconciliation of the two. It is up to us, I think, as modern magicians, to carry out this project. And Bruno can serve as a shining star, as an exemplar, to help illuminate that path forward. So, thank you very much.